Jasmine Crockett entered the Capitol to expose a 23-year secret. Trump sat smug unaware, the sealed DNA report, a missing 13-year-old, and billions in dark money were about to surface. This wasn't politics, it was reckoning. Would he survive the truth or be buried by it? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Jasmine Crockett was in Dallas, Texas, at her mother's hospital bedside when her phone buzzed at exactly 7:13 a.m. She thought it was a nurse. Instead, a calm, professional male voice came through, firm without hesitation. "Congresswoman Crockett, he said you've been added to an emergency oversight session. Noon. Rayburn Room 214. No details, no chance to argue." Jasmine glanced at her mother, pale asleep, hooked to a chemo drip, and forced herself to whisper, "I'll be back before the next bag finishes." She kissed her hand, stood up, and 30 minutes later was on a government flight to Washington, still unsure why she'd been summoned. But deep down, she already felt something was wrong. When she reached Capitol Hill, a black SUV was waiting in a quiet side lot, unmarked, spotless, silent. She walked toward it but froze. On the windshield corner was a silver USB drive taped down. No label, no case. Just a slip of paper tucked beneath the wiper with 4 words in block letters, "Play this alone." She stopped scanning the empty lot. No agents, no staff, no witnesses. She peeled the USB free, slipped it into her coat pocket, and climbed into the vehicle as if she were carrying a live grenade. The driver didn't say a word. Inside a secure side office, Jasmine locked the door, pulled the blinds, and booted up a classified laptop. Her hands were steady, but her breath wasn't. She slid the USB in. No password screen, no firewall, just one folder, confidential. She opened it. Inside was a single-file DNA report, 7913. She clicked. The screen flashed once, then revealed a 2-page medical report full of codes and lab terms. She read quickly until her eyes hit the final section. She froze, blinked, read it again. Her body went rigid. Subject 7912.3, a 13-year-old female recorded in March 2000, showed a 99.97% paternal DNA match. One name followed DJT, her lungs locked, her stomach flipped. It wasn't speculation, it was proof. A 13-year-old girl missing for 23 years. Her DNA tied directly to Donald J. Trump. Jasmine's hand hovered over the keyboard. She tried to breathe, but the next detail cut even deeper. In the corner was a faint red watermark. She leaned closer. Epstein Global Trust. This wasn't rumor. This was the legal shell behind a global trafficking empire the government had long tried to bury. Jasmine stared at the screen, her face drained. The report didn't scream, but the truth did. This wasn't politics. This wasn't gossip. This was evidence. And now it was hers. The screen went dark, but the truth stayed. It had seared itself into her like a scar. She didn't pace. She calculated. There was no time for fear, only action. She reached for a number almost no one in Congress knew. She had an encrypted line to a global transparency watchdog she'd once worked with, back when she still believed law could outrun corruption. She didn't plead. She gave coordinates and a deadline. "I need verification," she said, voice clipped, steady. "Genetics lab. Reykjavik, Iceland. Check for shell companies, U.S. ties, Epstein connections." 3 hours later, the reply hit like a hammer to the ribs. The lab was real, and its clients weren't just private, they were shielded. The Reykjavik Genomics Institute had run sealed private contracts for over 20 years. One top client, a Cayman Islands shell, tied through layers of intermediaries to both the Trump Organization and Epstein's trust. Jasmine's chest tightened. The office shrank around her. The walls stayed still, but the weight inside them crushed harder. Still, that wasn't what froze her blood. Hidden in the report was a code she couldn't ignore, TE45 PM. At first it looked random, but in the wire transfer records it showed up again and again, listed on secret logs from 1999 to 2002. Jasmine leaned back, staring at it like it could bite. This wasn't a mistake. It was a marker, a signal buried inside financial documents tied to offshore accounts in shady biomedical services. Whoever created it wasn't hiding by accident. They were hiding in plain sight, speaking in a code no system was meant to reveal. She needed someone who knew the inside, someone who had handled the data before it was cleaned away. Through an encrypted back channel, she traced a former technician, once part of the Reykjavik Genomics Institute, vanished from all records years ago. After 3 burner phones and fake emails, she finally got an answer. No names, no recordings. 1 call, 1 answer. She took it. The voice on the line was hollow slow, but every word cracked another wall. We ran hundreds of DNA tests, he said, but only one came with a gag order from 2 U.S. law firms. Jasmine leaned forward, her pulse racing. Tell me about the subject. Silence filled the line as if even the wires feared to carry the truth. Then came the reply. She was 13, pregnant. We flagged her as high risk for abuse. His tone dropped lower. She wasn't in the system. No consent forms. She was treated like property, processed, filed, erased. Jasmine's skin went cold. Everything fit, but in the worst way. She had one final question, the one that mattered most. Who paid for it? Her voice was steady, though inside she trembled. The man didn't pause, didn't hesitate. His words landed like a hammer. Not Epstein. The payment came from New York, from a client code marked DJT. Now the truth had a name. It wasn't buried in files anymore. It was staring her down, daring her to bury it or burn everything with it. She sat still, time dragging through the clock barely ticked 10 minutes. The evidence was clear, heavy, undeniable, radioactive. She knew the cost of exposing it. They'd smear her call, her unstable, divisive, accuse her of a witch hunt. They'd twist her race, her gender, even her mother's illness against her. You're not ready for this war, a voice whispered in her head. But louder still came another voice, the silent cry of the girl inside that report. Jasmine stared at the papers, the USB, the folder filled with truths buried under millions in hush money. The choice was brutal but simple: speak and risk everything, or stay silent and become part of the cover-up. She dialed the only person who wouldn't demand proof. 2 rings, then her mother's calm, steady voice. Jasmine couldn't speak at first. Her throat tightened, chest trembling. Ma, she whispered, I found something. Something terrible. About a girl, a missing one. Her mother didn't gasp, didn't panic. She just listened. Jasmine's voice cracked. If I speak out, they'll destroy me. They'll come for everything. A pause. Then her mother said, steady and certain, if it's the truth, then tell it for the girl who never could. Jasmine didn't cry. She didn't need to. The choice was already made. She hung up, shut off her phone, and began printing every file, every transfer, every scan. No binders, no polish. Just a plain black folder, the kind you carry when you're not asking for permission. She laid out the evidence like weapons, triple-checked every page, every chain of custody. She wrote her questions, sharp, surgical, deadly. When the last page slid from the printer, she didn't flinch. She rose, squared her shoulders, and walked out. She wasn't going to Congress to ask. She was going there to burn the lies down. Jasmine didn't enter that hearing room as a lawmaker. She walked in like a soldier, ready for her last battle, folder in hand, back straight, armed with nothing but the truth. The Oversight Committee chamber was packed to the brim. The air was thick with tension, heavy enough to cut. Lawmakers sat rigid, whispers low. C-SPAN cameras swung like predators hunting prey. No one spoke loudly. Everyone was watching one thing: the door. And when Jasmine Crockett walked through, silence followed. She didn't rush. Her steps were deliberate, steady like a drumbeat. Dressed in a charcoal suit, holding the black folder, she looked less like a congresswoman and more like someone walking into a courtroom to face execution. At the far end sat Donald J. Trump, flanked by lawyers, legs crossed, face blank, smile faint and forced. He nodded, half smug, half wary. She didn't nod back. She sat open the folder, breathed in. The room exhaled when her mic clicked alive. Jasmine glanced down once, then locked eyes with the committee. This, she said, voice firm, is a DNA report. She turned the page, revealing the scan, highlighted, timestamp, verified. Subject female 13, dated March 2000. Paternal match 99.97%. She paused. The numbers hit the room like an indictment. The girl vanished 23 years ago, she added. She was never found. Silence fell. Even the stenographer froze. Jasmine pressed on. This report has been confirmed by 3 independent labs, each certified, each sealed. She lifted her eyes, delivering the final strike. One of those labs was retained by Mr. Trump's own legal team. That sentence cracked the room like thunder in a vault. Someone in the third row flinched. An aide's pen fell to the floor. From the gallery above, even the reporters trained to be stone-faced looked at each other. Jasmine didn't move. She simply laid the papers down one after the other like placing evidence on a prosecutor's desk. Every inch of her was composed, but her tone had the weight of a verdict. Across the room, Trump tried to maintain his posture. The smirk was still there, but thinner now, twitching slightly at the corners. He glanced left then right. No words, just a jaw tight with calculation. For the first time in years, the former president looked unsettled, not furious, not mocking, just briefly unsure of which mask to wear. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was loaded, charged like a room full of dynamite where no one dared strike a match. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice. The truth had already raised itself. In those few sentences, she'd shifted the entire room from pageantry to reckoning. This wasn't politics anymore. It was exposure. And though Trump still sat behind his polished nameplate, a quiet truth began to settle into the bones of the room. He wouldn't be leaving this hearing untouched. The numbers had cut deep, but now it was time to show the wound, the part no statistic could describe, the part that bled. Jasmine didn't rush. She moved with the kind of care reserved for sacred things, slow, intentional, almost reverent. From her folder, she retrieved a page worn at the edges, with faint ink strokes curling like whispers across the paper. This, she said quietly, holding it up with both hands, is a diary entry, handwritten, belonging to the same 13-year-old girl in the DNA report. She turned it toward the panel, letting the camera zoom in. The page looked fragile, as if it might fall apart from memory alone. Jasmine read it aloud, her voice steady but low. He calls me his angel, but he is not God. He smiles when I cry. Her words didn't echo. They carved themselves into the silence like a blade through soft wood. No one moved. A chill swept through the chamber, the kind that doesn't come from temperature, but from the gut recognizing something unspeakable. Jasmine lowered the page slowly, her fingers careful not to smudge the ink, as if she knew it was written with pain. Then, without speaking, she reached into her folder again. This time it was a sonogram, grainy and black and white, the kind you see on refrigerators and in baby books. Only this one didn't belong to a celebration. She laid it beside the diary page with precision, forming a sentence without words. The image flickered under the lights, time-stamped, coded and chilling. A small life inside a body too young to carry it. And then Jasmine added the final page, a hospital confirmation document. She didn't need to narrate this one. She simply let the text speak for itself. After a beat of loaded silence, she stated as clearly as a verdict, the girl was 13 years old, pregnant. The sentence dropped like an iron weight onto the marble table. No outrage, no arguments. Just that unbearable, reverent stillness that takes over when horror stops being abstract. Jasmine continued, her voice firmer now, almost surgical. The test was conducted under a false identity at a private medical facility in Zurich. She said it not to shock, but to ensure no one could claim ignorance later. This wasn't a theory. This was procedure. This was premeditated. Behind her, the screen showed the ultrasound, the diary and the confirmation document side by side, past, present, and evidence laid bare. The contrast was nauseating, the innocence of the handwriting, the brutality of the scan, and the cold professionalism of the hospital record. One story told in 3 pages. None of them fiction. No one moved. Not a cough, not a shuffle. Even the staffers had stopped writing. Trump didn't say a word. His smile, already thinned in the previous round, was now completely gone. His expression, blank jaw, locked eyes darting not toward Jasmine, but toward his lawyers. One leaned in, but said nothing. What could be said, no one could unsee what had just been shown. And yet the weight of it hadn't even fully landed, because this wasn't the end of the hearing. This was just the sound of something beginning to shatter. The room had already been shattered by what Jasmine revealed about the girl. Her words, her silence, her unborn child. But now came the question no one had dared to ask. What was her life worth to the men who erased her? Jasmine took a slow breath, then lifted a folder stamped with red tabs, each one marking a different year. The pain didn't vanish, she said. It was buried under wire transfers. One by one, she laid the documents across the long table like playing cards in a game where only monsters win. More than $9 million. Over 7 years. Every payment meant to buy silence, clean a slate, or bury a child's scream. As she spoke, the screen behind her lit up with spreadsheet columns, dates, account codes, recipient names blurred into offshore shadows. These aren't business expenses. These are bribes masquerading as bookkeeping. She said, her voice cutting sharper with each word. And there's no IRS record, no tax trail, no legal explanation. These are just vanishing dollars slipping through the cracks of fake corporations owned by one man. She paused. Donald J. Trump. A low gasp stirred the air, but Jasmine didn't stop. She turned and nodded toward a silver-haired man in the gallery, neatly dressed, calm as a scalpel. This expert from the Department of the Treasury reviewed every transaction. He has no political interest, just numbers, just truth. The man stood, adjusted his glasses, and spoke with chilling clarity. These funds had no declared purpose, no taxable record, and no commercial trail. They were direct payments from Mr. Trump's shell entities to accounts tied to Jeffrey Epstein. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Because the words didn't shock, they confirmed. The room didn't recoil in disbelief. It recoiled in recognition. They had seen fragments of this system before on paper in whispers between headlines, but never this exposed, this complete, this raw. And then came the phrase that turned the chamber to stone. This is what we call money laundering through human disappearance, a sentence delivered without emotion because reality doesn't flinch. Jasmine let it sit there for a long moment, her eyes scanning the lawmakers in front of her. Let me repeat that, she said quietly. Money laundering through human disappearance. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, saturated. You could feel the architecture of the scheme folding in on itself, one line of transfer, one erased girl, one numbered shell company at a time. Jasmine pointed to the screen again. The names, the timelines, the payouts. Each line matched a period of silence. Each number matched a life never heard from again. This wasn't financial corruption. This was logistical cruelty, a system that turned children into ledger entries and then made them disappear. The numbers may have revealed a machine of silence, but a machine is only as dangerous as the men who run it. And now Jasmine had their voices. She didn't need a closing argument. She needed a speaker and 30 seconds of tape. Jasmine stepped forward and held up a small playback device, its red light blinking like a heartbeat. What you're about to hear, she said slowly, was not stolen. It was not edited. And it was verified by 3 independent forensic labs. Then she paused, let the silence bend, and pressed play. The recording began with faint background static. Then a voice came through, casual, callous, unmistakable. The girl starting to talk. It was Epstein, cold, clinical, as if talking about a storm rolling in. A beat of silence followed. Then another voice responded, lower, sharper, with that arrogant rasp the world knew too well. If it's mine, then it never happened. Donald J. Trump. The words detonated like a bomb in the hearing room. A collective jolt rippled across the chamber. One senator's pen dropped audibly on the desk. Another visibly turned pale. But Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes were locked, not on the recording, but on the man seated 20 feet away, still trying to hold together the shreds of a mask that had started to melt. Trump jolted forward in his seat, slamming his hand on the table. Fake, it's fucking fake. That's AI, you're using AI against me, he shouted, spittle, catching the mic, his voice cracking under the weight of exposure. But Jasmine didn't yell back. She simply stepped closer, her voice a scalpel. Your legal team authenticated this very recording 3 years ago. 3 independent forensic labs have since verified it, including one you personally contracted in 2021. She let the words sit. No fire, no fury, just precision. That kind of silence doesn't need echo, it becomes its own verdict. Trump froze. The room watched him not as a man now, but as a voice that had just confessed without realizing it had been heard. And Jasmine. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The tape had already done it for her. After Trump's voice echoed through the chamber, Jasmine brought forward the only voice that truly mattered, the one they were never supposed to hear. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached for a drive, silver plane, no label. Her fingers were steady now. This, she said, comes from a source known only as Echolade, a hacker, a ghost, but one who got into something real. She paused. A hidden archive called Project Angel. Inside dozens of audio files, medical reports, transfers, pictures, years of documentation buried so deep it took 5 firewalls to touch it. Then she leaned in, and one recording, that stopped me cold. The screen behind her flickered to black. One word appeared, Moran. No one spoke. She pressed play. The room filled with static, then a voice raw and broken, barely there. If anyone hears this, a sharp breath, then softer shaking. Tell my mom I forgive her. That was it. Just that. Then silence. No one blinked. It wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It felt like a graveyard. One voice, one whisper from a girl who vanished 23 years ago had just torn through every wall of denial in the room. This wasn't politics now. It wasn't a debate. It was a child reaching through wires and time asking anyone to carry her last words home. A senator near the back looked away, visibly shaken. One aide covered her mouth to hold back tears. Jasmine didn't say another word. She just lowered her hand as if to gently place Marin's voice down, with the care it had been denied in life. And in that moment, the most powerful people in America were completely, utterly speechless. After the chilling voice of Marin faded into silence, there was a shift in the room. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was humanity. And Jasmine's next move was about to strike at the heart of that silence. The courtroom doors opened again, but this time there was no sound, no shuffle of papers, no whispers. Iveta Kinich entered slowly, her head slightly bowed, as if carrying the weight of 2 administrations on her shoulders. Once one of Melania Trump's most trusted aides, Iveta had lived in the background of power for nearly a decade, silent, invisible, but always watching. Now she stood at the center of a storm. Her voice was soft but unwavering. In 2018, she began. Mrs. Trump found a folder tucked inside a locked cabinet belonging to her husband. The chamber went still again. Inside were medical records, photographs, and a DNA report, all pointing to a girl named Marin. The weight of that name again struck the room like a hammer. But Iveta didn't flinch. She continued, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Mrs. Trump did not question her husband about it. She didn't ask where it came from. Instead, she placed the documents into her private safe. A pause. She never opened it again. Her voice trembled just slightly. She said she couldn't bear the thought of Baron growing up with that kind of shadow over his name. Jasmine listened, her expression unreadable. The room was waiting for her to lash out, for fury, for judgment. But instead she stepped forward, and her tone shifted from steel to something more human. I don't blame her, Jasmine said. Maybe she thought silence was safety. Maybe she thought it would protect someone she loved. Then her voice grew sharper, not in anger, but in truth. She turned toward the Senate panel, her eyes locked on every member. But if even the First Lady couldn't protect the truth for a little girl, then whoever will. The room didn't explode. It imploded into silence, into reflection, into a discomfort too sharp to ignore. Jasmine hadn't fired a shot. She'd opened a wound that had never healed. The chamber was still reeling from the revelation that Maureen had been silenced not just in body, but in history. But Jasmine wasn't finished. The next file in her hands wasn't just paper, it was a body count in disguise. Jasmine inhaled slowly, letting the silence hang a moment longer, before breaking it with her voice calm, cold and clear. This, she said, lifting a thick manila folder labeled Storage 47B, was found inside a shuttered facility under the name Eastgate Holdings. The building belongs to a holding company owned by Epstein, now defunct, scrubbed from most U.S. databases, but not from Iceland's warehouse logs. Her eyes scanned the room, pausing on each senator, then landing squarely on Trump. Inside, we found dozens of boxes labeled as archival waste. But one box wasn't waste. It was a name, Maria Lane. She opened the folder and held up a yellow death certificate, a name that didn't exist before 2001, a certificate that never passed through any state records. No hospital, no funeral, no real cause of death. Her tone dropped to a simmer, because Maria Lane wasn't dead. She never existed. She was an alias. She clicked her remote and a lab report appeared on the screen behind her. At the top, sample 47B12, Blood analysis. At the bottom, paternal DNA matched 99.97%, Donald J. Trump. Gas swept through the room like a gust of wind. Even the stenographer stopped typing. Jasmine continued, steady as ever. Independent verification confirmed the blood sample from the storage unit belonged to Marin. The chain of custody is intact. Date of viability, 2002. Meaning, she was still alive 2 years after her last sighting. She let that sentence settle, so if she was declared dead on paper, but alive in a blood lab, someone didn't just cover up her story. They tried to erase her entire existence. Trump's face changed. It wasn't the loud denial this time, nor the performative smirk. It was something smaller, a twitch in the corner of his mouth, the way his hand clenched the armrest just a bit too tight. Jasmine didn't need to look at him. She placed the fake certificate beside the DNA report and let the visuals speak. "You want to know what human erasure looks like?" she asked the room. "It looks like a forged death, a stolen name, a girl stuffed in a filing cabinet marked disposal." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. But the blood said otherwise. Nobody moved. The camera zoomed in, but there was no commentary, no whisper from journalists. Just the weight of something so specific, so real it couldn't be spun. It wasn't just about Marin anymore. It was about how many others had been buried on paper, erased not with weapons but with whiteout and wires. And now Jasmine had just unearthed one. The echoes of blood certificates and erased lives faded, but now the most chilling sound in the archive awaited. Jasmine leaned forward, her pulse steady despite the tremor in the air. She reached for the final file on the table, one that had lingered as the unspoken crescendo of this hearing. With a resolute motion, she clicked play. "There's one more recording," she said, voice tight but controlled. "It was buried deep, flagged as corrupted in the digital log, but the truth doesn't stay corrupt forever." The playback started with static, then two voices emerged like ghosts clawing their way out from darkness. "Epstein, 4 million now. If the girl disappears again, you get the island. Trump, I like islands, especially the ones without reporters." That brief exchange cut through the room like a scalpel. No theatrics, no frills, just pure transactional callousness. For a long moment, the chamber gripped silence, an audience held by words no one wanted to hear but couldn't unhear. The power of credibility isn't in who says something. It's in who doesn't deny it. Jasmine let that silence settle before she spoke again. Words quiet, cold, and final. They didn't just erase a girl. They turned her life into a ledger entry. Every head in the room turned. No one dared blink. She held up the transcript, letting the final syllables hang in the air like verdicts. They monetized her heart. They didn't just buy silence. They bought murder without the body. Trump sat unmoving as if his skin had stiffened. The political bravado evaporated. The cameras clicked, but their lenses couldn't capture the gravity behind those words. He wasn't protected by law today, only by the collapse of his own defenses. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She closed the folder with deliberate calm and let the weight of that revelation anchor everything that followed. The air still echoed with Jasmine's final damning words about islands, about vanished lives turned into numbers. But justice doesn't arrive with a line, it arrives with a vote. And now that moment had come. The Capitol chamber, once filled with whispers, was now bone-silent, dead still, as if the building itself dared not breathe. Eyes from both sides of the aisle fixed on the digital panel above the committee bench. One by one, names were called. One by one, they voted. Yes. Yes. Abstain. Yes. Some voices were firm, others cracked. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Her eyes never left the tally screen, not because she needed reassurance, but because she was watching the wall crumble. When the final count blinked to life, 14 in favor, 3 opposed, no one cheered. No applause broke out. Instead, there was a heavier sound, that of a nation exhaling a truth it had buried for decades. Across the room, reporters tightened their grips on pens that had just recorded history. Veterans shifted in their seats, shoulders sagging as if they had carried this truth for years without knowing its weight. A man in uniform closed his eyes, whispering something in Spanish. Maybe a prayer, maybe a name. A middle-aged woman with silver hair, wearing a nurse's badge and a yellowed ribbon for missing children, nodded without speaking. Parents in the back row held hands, trembling. knowing their children would never come back, but finally someone's daughter had spoken for them all. There was no clapping, just tears, just the breath of justice waking up after decades of sleep. Jasmine stood still in the center of it all, not victorious, not smug, not triumphant. She didn't raise her fist. She didn't smile. Her hands trembled ever so slightly at her sides, her chest rising and falling, as if she had run a marathon of souls. This wasn't vindication, it was responsibility. The truth had finally entered the room, but it came wearing the faces of children who were no longer alive to see it. Her voice when it came was low, so quiet it pulled everyone closer. If your daughter disappeared, wouldn't you want someone to ask why the question didn't need an answer? Because in that moment, everyone already knew it. Jasmine wasn't speaking as a congresswoman. She wasn't speaking as an investigator or a witness. She was speaking as someone who had chosen to carry the grief no one else dared name, and in doing so, she gave the nation no place left to hide. It wasn't politics anymore. It wasn't party lines. It was a funeral no one had been allowed to attend. It was a grave without a name finally being read aloud. The silence that followed was thicker than before. Not awkward, reverent, the kind of silence that holds guilt, sorrow, and revelation in its teeth. Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes scanned the room not for praise, not for permission, but for accountability. For the men and women who had worn denial like a suit. For the officials who had signed documents knowing what they concealed. For the lawmakers who had called her dramatic, extreme, unprofessional. They weren't laughing now. Even those who had voted no looked away, unable to meet her gaze. And still Jasmine didn't look away. Because this wasn't the end, it was only the threshold. The 14-3 vote wasn't a medal. It was a door creaking open toward a storm that had been waiting too long. The committee's decision to launch a criminal investigation into Donald J. Trump and the network of corporations tied to him and Jeffrey Epstein wasn't just a legal event, it was a national reckoning. A message carved in thunder that power, no matter how protected, could still be questioned. That girls like Maureen, once vanished into silence, could still echo into the halls of Congress. Outside, the news broke like a dam. C-SPAN footage hit every feed. Subtitles read, "Investigation opened. Trump under formal criminal inquiry." But inside, none of that mattered. Because what Jasmine had done wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about party wins. It was about giving language to the unspeakable. A few seats down, an older woman clutched a faded photo of a child missing since 1998. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. But her eyes locked onto Jasmine with a look of something more powerful than gratitude, solidarity. The kind that doesn't need applause. Just a nod, a breath, a knowing. A man in uniform, navy by his ribbons, stood up slowly. "It's about damn time," he said under his breath. His partner beside him whispered, "She did it. She actually did it." But Jasmine didn't respond. She remained still, staring ahead, holding the final silence that belonged to Marin. Reporters jostled to get closer. Microphones turned on. Staffers in suits adjusted ties and whispered among themselves. But Jasmine didn't budge. The moment wasn't about the cameras. It was about the mothers who'd waited 23 years for someone to believe them. About the girls who'd been written off as runaways, whose cases never made it past the first desk. About the systems that cashed checks instead of asking questions. About the ones who stayed silent, not out of fear, but out of strategy. The committee chair leaned forward. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his voice measured, "we will now recess and proceed per federal referral guidelines." But she didn't sit. She nodded politely, collected her folder, and then turned slowly to face the crowd once more. No gesture, no speech, just a presence. A woman who'd come to Washington not to seek power, but to break its silence. And for one fleeting second, everyone in that room knew history wasn't written in ink that day. It was written in blood, sweat, and the voice of one girl whose name had finally been spoken. The vote was done. The gavel had struck. But justice is not a vote, it's a memory. And memories are not buried in courtrooms. They're buried in soil beneath names too long ignored. The wind was calm, but there was no peace in the air. Jasmine Crockett stood still just outside the black gate of Greenwood Hills Cemetery, staring at a row of fresh marble headstones glinting under a fading sun. The grass was too neat, the trees too silent. There was no applause, no camera crews shouting questions. Only a gathering storm of people behind her. Mothers, fathers, nurses, veterans, and those who had buried too many truths in too many places like this. Jasmine didn't speak. Not yet. She was holding something in her hand, something small, simple, and terrifyingly symbolic, a white rose. Her steps toward the grave were slow, deliberate. Each one carried not just her weight, but the weight of a name that had once disappeared into a file folder labeled missing. But now that name had a place, a stone, a date, a space to say she existed. The headstone read, Marin Elise Connors, born 1987, beloved daughter, forever missed. There was no end date, no death certificate, just acknowledgement. For the first time in 23 years, Marin wasn't a rumor. She was real. Jasmine knelt. The rose in her hand trembled slightly as she placed it gently at the base of the grave. It wasn't for a photo, it wasn't for show. It was for Marin, for the girl who had been sold silenced, rewritten, renamed, and nearly erased. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the silence do what words couldn't. The wind brushed her hair like a mother brushing back tears. Behind her, the crowd began to form a half circle, not speaking, not moving. They came from different worlds, some in military uniforms, others in hospital scrubs, a few holding framed photographs of children that had never come home. A woman clutched a baby blanket that hadn't been unfolded in 16 years. An older man held a flag folded into a triangle his son had gone missing overseas, not from war, but from paperwork no one dared open. These weren't spectators. They were survivors of silence. Jasmine rose, slowly brushed the grass from her knees and turned to face them. The cameras stayed back. Someone had told them this moment was not for headlines, but for healing. A nurse with silver hair stepped forward, her hands shaking as she held up a candle already lit. Then another candle. Then another. Soon the entire crowd stood bathed in a quiet glow. No slogans, no chants. Just light in a place where darkness had lived too long. Jasmine looked into their eyes. Some were red from crying, others burned with fury. All of them were waiting for words, for meaning, for something that could explain why justice had taken 2 decades, and a girl's voice had only just been heard. Jasmine's voice didn't waver. She didn't shout. She didn't preach. She simply asked, if your daughter disappeared, wouldn't you want someone to ask why the question fell like a stone into a still lake? Ripples of silence followed. No one moved, because they all knew this wasn't about one girl anymore. It never had been. It was about every daughter who had been ignored, every mother who had been dismissed, every system that had closed its doors just when the truth began to knock. One father put his arm around his wife and whispered something only she could hear. A veteran dropped to one knee and touched the ground, as if saluting a soldier whose war had never been acknowledged. A young woman in the back sobbed uncontrollably, not because she knew Marin, but because she had been Marin once in a foster home no one believed. Jasmine stood quietly, letting the weight of their collective grief settle. There was nothing left to perform. No more arguments to win. The courtroom was gone, but the trial, the real one, was just beginning. And yet, even in that quiet, something had shifted. Jasmine could feel it not as a politician, but as a human being. For so long, the fight had been about evidence, documents, recordings, votes. But here at this grave, the fight was about remembrance, recognition, the right for a child not to vanish into footnotes and case numbers. A single headstone had done what thousands of pages hadn't. It made the story real. The people began placing their candles at the base of the stone. Some placed photographs, others small toys, folded notes or drawings signed with children's names. A teacher left a worn-out student ID card. A janitor left the key to a locker that had never been emptied. No one asked for permission. They simply gave what they had. Jasmine knelt once more and pressed her hand flat against the marble. Her fingers trembled, but not from fear, from responsibility, because now the world couldn't unsee it. Behind her, the Capitol dome stood tall in the distance, just barely visible through the trees. It had taken years to bring this truth there, but today Jasmine had brought the truth here, where it belonged, to the only place Marin had never been allowed to rest. They called her a statistic, Jasmine whispered. They buried her with numbers and lies, but today she gets her name back. Someone in the crowd began to hum a low melody. Others joined in. It wasn't a protest song. It was something older, softer, like a lullaby for a child who had never been tucked in again. And as the melody rose and fell, Jasmine took one step back then another, letting the crowd surround the grave, letting the people who had once been forgotten become the keepers of memory. She didn't need to say more. Her question was already echoing across the country, in classrooms, in kitchens, in churches, in neighborhoods, in police stations, in courtrooms, where names had been pushed to the bottom of the docket. That question wasn't a closing line. It was a match. If your daughter disappeared, wouldn't you want someone to ask why? And with that, Jasmine turned, walked down the hill, and disappeared into the crowd. Not as a politician, not as a hero, but as someone who had finally done what no one else dared look injustice in the eye, and give it a name. As the candles dimmed and the people slowly dispersed, Jasmine stood alone at the edge of the hill, watching the wind brush through the grass above Marian's grave. The cameras were gone. The headlines had moved on. But the questions still lingered unanswered, unresolved, unforgettable. What happened in that hearing room was not just a confrontation. It was a mirror, one that forced a nation to look directly into the face of everything it had chosen to forget. For years, stories like Marin's had been silenced under redactions, buried under bureaucracy, or simply labeled too sensitive for the public. But Marin wasn't sensitive. She was real. She laughed, she bled, she trusted, and she was betrayed. The story wasn't just about political power or legal reckoning. It was about the cost of silence, the price paid when dignity is treated as a variable, not a constant. Jasmine didn't walk away as a victor. There were no trophies, no confetti, no triumphant music playing as she left the Capitol or the cemetery. What she carried instead was far heavier, the faces of those who would never get their answers, the children whose photos never made it to prime time, the families who were told to move on before they could even begin to grieve, and perhaps most painfully, the mothers who stayed quiet because speaking up meant losing everything else they had left. These weren't distant tragedies. They were next-door neighbors, co-workers, forgotten files sitting in the bottom drawer of someone's desk waiting for a name. Because the truth is, this story was never just about Trump or Epstein or one girl. It was about how a system can be weaponized against the very people it was meant to protect. It was about how power, when unchecked, can turn innocence into currency. It was about what happens when comfort matters more than truth. And it was about what can change when one woman refuses to stay quiet, even when the whole room tells her to shut up. Marin Elise Connors became more than a name. She became a question, a challenge, a reflection. She represented the children who are taught not to speak unless spoken to, the victims who were handed settlement papers instead of apologies, the survivors who were told they were asking for it. She represented every whisper that got buried under campaign money, every report that was marked closed before the interview even began. And in reclaiming her story, Jasmine reminded us that history doesn't always live in textbooks. Sometimes it lives in courtrooms and DNA results, in shaky recordings, and in one mother's scream that was never meant to be heard. But the deepest lesson came not from the evidence, not from the courtroom, not even from the grave. It came from the silence that followed, the silence of people suddenly asking themselves, have I ever looked away? Have I ever called a lie, complicated, just to avoid confronting it? Because the enemy in this story wasn't just a man or a network or a corrupted company. It was a culture of convenience, a habit of avoidance, a country that often prefers smooth illusions over jagged truth. And if this moment taught us anything, it's that change doesn't come when the truth is found. It comes when the truth is no longer denied. The drama of the hearing, the gasps, the shouts, the documents was only the beginning. What mattered more was what people did once they left the room. Did they talk to their children differently? Did they ask harder questions of the leaders they once cheered for? Did they finally, after decades of shrugging, say enough? The test of a nation is not in how loud it applauds after a verdict. It's in how deeply it listens when a child says, I was hurt. And perhaps that's what Jasmine was really trying to show, that justice is not a headline. It's a habit, a way of showing up again and again for the people who've been ignored. Jasmine Crockett became a symbol not of perfection, not of power, but of persistence, of someone who kept asking when everyone else had stopped. She didn't bring a sword to the Capitol. She brought a folder, a photograph, a heartbeat, and in doing so, she forced the entire country to confront one devastating truth, that the most dangerous weapon in the world isn't a gun or a bomb, it's indifference. Indifference is what lets predators walk free. Indifference is what buries girls in unmarked files. Indifference is what smiles politely and says, "Let's not talk about that here." But Jasmine talked. She screamed. She demanded. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching from Texas to Vermont to that one quiet living room in Iowa that silence is not neutral. Silence is a choice. And in some cases, it's a crime. Because the moment we stop asking questions, we stop seeing people. We stop seeing Marin. And when that happens, we don't just lose a case, we lose our soul. This story will fade from headlines as all stories do. The networks will move on. The algorithms will feed something else. But the lesson can't fade. It has to settle in our bones. It has to become the conversation at dinner tables, in classrooms, at police stations, inside family courts, and behind closed doors. Because this wasn't a movie. It wasn't fiction. It was real. And the only thing more unbearable than the truth is repeating it. So what now? So now we ask. We ask harder. We ask louder. We ask even when it makes people uncomfortable. We ask when our voices shake. We ask even when the answer might hurt. Because asking is the beginning of justice. And justice doesn't begin in court, it begins in the gut. In the moment a mother looks at a closed case and says, "No, I'm not done yet." And maybe that's the final legacy of Marin Elise Connors. Not just a girl stolen, not just a file unsealed, but a question that can't be ignored anymore. A simple, devastating, revolutionary question. If your daughter disappeared, wouldn't you want someone to ask why? As Jasmine's final words echoed across the crowd. If your daughter disappeared, wouldn't you want someone to ask why there was no applause? No cheering, just silence. A silence heavier than any courtroom gavel, deeper than any breaking news alert. Because this story didn't end at the grave. It started something bigger. What began as a hearing turned into a reckoning, and what unfolded in that chamber wasn't about politics anymore. It was about decency. It was about whether we as a people are willing to look pain in the face when it's not trending. Marin's name wasn't just carved into a stone, it was etched into the conscience of a country that had too often buried its shame behind sealed files, hush money, and headlines designed to distract. The story didn't scream scandal. It whispered something far more dangerous: truth. And truth has no PR team. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care who you voted for, how powerful you are, or what narrative you want to sell. It either lives in the light or rots in the dark. This wasn't a story about heroes and villains in the cinematic sense. Jasmine wasn't perfect. She had her fears, her doubts, her moments of being overwhelmed. But that's what made her powerful. She didn't win by shouting the loudest. She won by refusing to sit down. She didn't come to destroy anyone. She came to protect someone, a girl most people had forgotten. And in doing that, she reminded the world of something far more important than political loyalty: the value of a single human life. Not because it made headlines, not because it affected polls, but because it existed. The lesson here isn't just to be outraged when the story breaks. It's to be present before it does. Ask questions before the silence grows too loud. Protect the vulnerable before the predators organize. Stand with the unseen before their names appear on memorial plaques. Because Marin was real, and there are thousands more like her who won't ever make it to a microphone, a committee vote, or a televised investigation. Their truth lives in shadows, in therapy rooms, in foster homes, in shelters, in quiet bedrooms, where fear lives just under the surface. And if this story taught us anything, it's this: those shadows are not empty. They are full of people waiting to be believed. We often talk about justice like it's a building, marble grand, unshakable. But justice isn't made of stone. It's made of people. It's made of questions asked at the wrong time, of voices that refuse to be silenced, of uncomfortable truths spoken in inconvenient rooms. And most importantly, it's made of decisions. Decisions to care, to act, to not walk away just because something feels too heavy or too distant. Jasmine didn't change the world with a miracle. She changed it by choosing to go deeper, by asking one more question when everyone else said drop it. And that is the power each of us holds, not in our titles, not in our Twitter bios, but in the daily invisible decisions to pay attention, to notice, to push back. You don't need a badge or a committee seat to ask, where did that girl go? You don't need a law degree to say, that doesn't feel right. All you need is the courage to stop pretending it's not your problem. Because what this story showed in the most painful way is that the moment we treat someone else's child as someone else's responsibility, we all lose something. It's easy to believe that evil looks like a monster, but the truth is evil often wears a smile. It shakes hands. It hosts fundraisers. It signs checks. It attends galas with clean suits and perfect optics. And the only thing more dangerous than evil is the silence that lets it thrive. Jasmine didn't just pull back a curtain. She tore it down. She exposed how clean the world had made its messes look, how easy it is to delete a life not with a weapon, but with a wire transfer and a closed door. And by showing that, she reminded us that exposure is the beginning of justice, but action is the soul of it. So what do we do with that? We hold people accountable, not just in office, but in our own circles. We stop laughing at the wrong jokes. We challenge the toxic norms passed off as tradition. We tell our sons that masculinity is not measured by control. We tell our daughters that silence is not safety. We tell ourselves that looking away makes us part of the problem, not the solution. Jasmine's legacy isn't just about what she uncovered, it's about what she ignited. A national discomfort, a moral migraine, a wake-up call we can't hit snooze on anymore. And if there's one thing that burns brighter than all the evidence, all the headlines, all the gasps, it's this: the power of the question. A simple one that Jasmine left the entire country with, one that refuses to go away. It's not wrapped in policy or ideology or partisanship. It's human, brutally, beautifully human. If your daughter disappeared, wouldn't you want someone to ask why that question is now ours to carry? Not just in Capitol hearings, not just in breaking news, but in everyday life. When we hear something that doesn't sit right, when someone flinches at the wrong moment, when a child stops smiling for no clear reason, when a mother cries in a language we don't understand, that question must live in our decisions, our empathy, our refusal to pretend it's not my business. Because the truth is, this story could have ended differently. Marin could have remained a footnote. Jasmine could have stayed quiet. The world could have moved on comfortably numb. But it didn't. Not because of politics, not because of strategy, but because one woman refused to accept that a child's pain could be buried beneath convenience. That's not just a message. That's a mission. And now it's in our hands. Will we walk away, or will we be the ones who stay and ask why Jasmine's voice may have faded with the wind at Marin's grave? But her question didn't die. It spread, quietly, relentlessly. And now it's not just a story, it's a mirror. And the reflection staring back isn't just about Washington or Wall Street, it's about us. Because here's the truth: injustice doesn't always knock on the front door with sirens. It slips through the cracks in our everyday choices. It hides behind polite silences, behind not my business shrugs, behind headlines we scroll past because they're too heavy to carry. But what this story taught us is that someone always pays the price for our comfort, and it's rarely the powerful. It's the invisible, the forgotten, the voiceless. And they're not characters in a drama. They're your neighbors, your coworkers, your nieces, your son's classmates. And they don't need your pity, they need your presence. So what now? What do you do after a story like this slaps you awake? Start where you are. Look closer at the world around you. That girl walking home alone every night after closing the diner. Ask if she's safe. That boy who hasn't smiled since Christmas check-in. That woman who flinches when her phone rings. She's not being dramatic. She might be trapped. And you don't need a courtroom, a camera crew, or a congressional badge to make a difference. You just need to care enough to ask, are you okay? Can I help? What happened? Those three questions can break chains. Real ones. The kind silence keeps locked. And if you're ready for more, go further. Volunteer at a crisis center, mentor a teen, support local journalists who investigate the stories no one wants to touch. Demand transparency in how law enforcement handles missing persons cases. Push your schools to teach not just math and history, but boundaries, consent, and how to speak up when something's wrong. Don't just protect your kids. Protect the ones no one's watching. And if you think you're just one person without power, without reach, remember Jasmine. She didn't hold the highest office. She wasn't a billionaire. She wasn't backed by an army. She walked into a room of men who tried to silence her, and she shattered them with truth. Not because she was perfect, but because she was relentless. And you have that same fire inside you. Whether it's in a church meeting, a school board, hearing a family gathering, or a Facebook post, use it. Don't let the system convince you that your voice only matters on election day. Let it matter every day. When someone makes an inappropriate joke, don't laugh. When a neighbor goes missing, ask why. When a system prioritizes optics over people, burn the optics and protect the people. You are not powerless. You are not too late. You are not too small. The world doesn't change with hashtags. It changes when someone shows up, uninvited, asks the uncomfortable question, and refuses to sit down until the truth stands up. That could be you. In fact, it has to be you. Because if we don't speak for the Marines of the world, who will? If we don't show up for the ones buried beneath convenience and corruption, who will? You may not have Jasmine's platform, but you have a voice. And if enough voices speak in unison, the ground starts to shake. Systems crack, silence splits, and people trapped in darkness finally see a light. So start today. Make the call you've been avoiding. Stand up in the meeting you've stayed quiet in. Ask your school board where the funding for mental health really went. Look your elected officials in the eye and say, I'm watching. Because that's how change begins. Not with explosions, but with accountability. Where did that girl go? Why wasn't she protected? Who decided her pain was disposable? Don't let those questions die with the story. Keep them alive. And let them live in the way you walk through the world, bolder, sharper, louder. Let them live in how you raise your kids, in how you challenge your friends, in how you vote, in how you love, in how you listen. Because at the end of the day, Jasmine's fight wasn't about one name, one case, or one moment. It was about awakening a nation that forgot how to care. Let this be the moment we remember. And if your voice trembles when you first speak, let it. Trembling voices still save lives. And maybe this was never just about Jasmine. Maybe it was about us, the parents who stay up all night because something feels off, the veterans who fought for justice abroad only to see silence win at home, the nurses who've seen too many girls walk in, bleeding, and walk out forgotten. Maybe it's about every single person who's ever asked, what if that were my daughter, but didn't know what to do next? Because this time the answer isn't more silence. This time we speak, we act, we ask the questions they don't want asked, and we stand for those who never got to stand for themselves. Because somewhere out there, another Marine is waiting, and she deserves a world that never forgets her name. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.